This video is an AI historical reconstruction based on records from the period, created for educational and narrative purposes.
When Titanic scraped the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., the news did not reach the lounges first. It hit down here, in the steel heart that kept everything alive. What was routine turned into a technical sprint against physics. Evidence suggests that keeping power and pumps running longer helped other parts of the ship function for a few decisive minutes. If you want to see how those first minutes unfolded inside the engine rooms, hit like and subscribe, then come down with me to the place almost nobody saw when it happened. The voyage depends on a steady cycle, steam made in the boilers, pressure kept in check, the big engines moving without interruption. Gauges and valves are watched like the ship's heartbeat. Any vibration outside the norm can mean overheating, misalignment, efficiency slipping away. The deck plates tremble constantly and moisture hangs in the air from condensation. Down here there is no such thing as quiet. The sound of machinery takes over everything. On a normal night, the goal is simple and unforgiving. Keep the system predictable. In the boiler rooms, the ship's energy is born from repetitive, brutal work. Open furnaces throw light across metal, and the heat turns the air into something you cannot breathe for long. Pressure has to stay inside safe bands to feed the engines without instability. Readings are checked and logged so shifts can spot drift before it becomes trouble. Ash, coal dust, and steam cling to skin and fabric. Titanic may look like luxury upstairs, but down here it is pure industry. Between the boiler fire and the force of the engines, the support systems are what let the ship survive everyday life. Drains pull off condensation, pumps keep the bilges under control. Electricity holds up lights and essential equipment. A small leak or a damp cable can snowball into a cascading failure if it is not caught early. That is why the job is about details: a new sound, a dry vibration, the smell of steam, the way a needle responds. Almost nothing draws attention from the outside, but everything matters on the inside. It is preventive maintenance in real time. A calm night does not mean the system relaxes. Metal is always working under heat and pressure, and conditions can flip fast when something drifts off pattern. A needle that swings too wide, a different hum, a vibration that turns dry instead of smooth. Every one of those becomes a signal. Checks move across joints, access points, and the lowest levels, because seepage shows up first where the ship meets the sea. Electrical gear is sensitive to moisture, and it demands constant watch. It still feels like routine, but the margin for error is already shrinking. Outside, the sea is glass flat and the ship keeps moving, lit up like always. Down here, the impact does not arrive as an explosion. It arrives as a long scrape and a tremor that runs through plates, brackets, and pipes. Lights flicker, tools vibrate. The sound of the machinery shifts for a heartbeat. The response becomes procedure. Stabilize flow, check readings, run to the lowest points. The core question changes fast from, "What was that?" to, "Where is the water coming from?" Every minute decides what can still be controlled. Once the collision is confirmed, the goal becomes operational control. Furnaces are shut and secured to reduce fire risk and to keep the system more predictable. Steam is redistributed to support pumps and essential services without dropping pressure too hard, too fast. The crew fights to keep power steady because lights and internal operations depend on it. Even if the outside looks unchanged, the inside is already running on contingency. The priority is to buy time, safely. Inspections push toward watertight doors and service accesses that now function like borders. Lantern beams sweep seams and corners, and cables are lifted so they do not lie in wet decking. The air changes, a strange cold rises, and beneath the mechanical roar you begin to hear water. The ship still has strength, but the direction of the problem is no longer a mystery. When the lights dip and return, it is not panic, it is diagnosis. Electrical stability is getting fragile, and the clock is speeding up. Water finally shows itself on the deck, spreading with steady intent. The response is technical. Increase pumping, feed the lines with steam, protect electrical distribution before moisture reaches critical points. Valves are cranked hard, levers lock in to keep pumps working. The sound changes. The machines keep their rhythm, but now water is competing for the same space. The goal is not to beat the flooding, it is to buy usable minutes. Outside, Titanic still looks like a ship simply traveling. As flooding grows, internal routes stop being passageways and start becoming barriers. Watertight doors and narrow corridors decide what is still reachable and what must be left behind. Loose parts can turn into hazards, so anything that can be strapped down or stabilized gets handled fast. Water changes the ship's sound, as if the hull starts resonating in a different key. The logic of the work shifts. It is no longer about efficiency, it is about system survival. Outside, the lights stay steady, for now. Now the mission is blunt. Keep pumping in power for as long as possible. Steam is routed to auxiliaries. Regulators are adjusted. The electrical boards are reconfigured to reduce the risk of shorts as moisture creeps in. Every reading that holds steady means extra minutes of light, internal communication, and functioning in critical areas. It is invisible work, but it has real consequences for the rest of the ship. With every adjustment, the question is the same. What lasts longer without collapsing? If you want to follow this sequence precisely, hit like and subscribe. Moisture takes over the space. Low steam. Fog. Spray that cuts visibility and turns the deck into a trap. Lanterns and lamps become safety gear, not just light. Cables and boxes are shielded because water and electricity do not forgive. The sound changes too. Water adds a constant weight beneath the mechanical beat. Everything takes longer, not because anyone hesitates, but because the physical conditions get worse. Still, the objective does not change. Keep what matters running. Flooding stops feeling localized and starts behaving like a rising volume. Water lines and internal currents show the ship is losing usable space below. Pumps continue, but they depend on open lines, working intakes, and enough steam to feed them. Risk multiplies. Slipping, losing access, lights failing, panels getting hit by moisture. So routes are reinforced, control points are protected, and everything is done with careful speed. On the upper decks, the night can still look normal from a distance. This is the most intense stretch of the early phase. Water rising, steam hugging the deck. Constant vibration in a tight space. Pumps run near their limit and demand stable feed to keep their rhythm. Lights flicker and throw fast shadows across wet metal, catwalks, and railings. The contrast is physical. Industrial heat and freezing seawater sharing the same air. What happens here is not theatrical heroism, it is technical control under pressure. From here on, every minute costs more. Containment turns into a chain of seconds. Lift lines, seal panels, tighten connections, keep routes open. Doors and passages shrink options and narrow movement. Visibility gets worse, so order depends on light kept above the waterline and on clear paths that people can follow without thinking. Outside, the ship can still feel whole. Down here, space is disappearing fast. The focus is to stop electrical failures from triggering the blackout early. Every action is small. The accumulated effect decides how long the ship stays functional. After the immediate peak, the strategy becomes more selective. Protect what is essential, cut what could take everything down. Lower circuits are isolated to prevent a cascading blackout. Pressure is tuned to sustain pumps and lighting, even with a tighter margin. Tools and materials are secured so they do not slide with the growing list and become obstacles or missiles. Water is no longer just present. It dictates the sound, the pace, and the safety of every step. Outside, lights still shine, but they no longer guarantee calm. With routes reduced, movement becomes logistics. Paths are chosen for feasibility, not convenience, and access points are checked like exits. Adjustments to power boards and steam routing aim to prevent premature shutdowns, keeping control points alive. The goal is coordination. Enough light, pumps still working, paths still usable. At the same time, clearer signs of preparation begin above deck. Stability now depends on small technical actions repeated again and again under worsening conditions. The ship's growing angle starts interfering directly with the work. Water stops behaving like a flat sheet and begins moving in waves, pushed by the changing list. Hoses and lines pull against the flow, demanding strength and constant grip on railings. Lamps swing harder, and vibration feels uneven, making instruments harder to read. Outside, the surface still looks calm, but inside the pattern is unmistakable. Progressive loss. The ship is changing in measurable ways. Power becomes the last reliable form of stability. Needle fluctuations and brief dips in light reveal a system that is increasingly sensitive to moisture and shifting load. The crew watches instruments almost without pause, trying to keep partial operation without inviting a short. Pumps continue, but they fight higher water, low steam, and tighter access. The goal is to avoid a simultaneous collapse. Keep as much running as possible in stages. Outside, lights still reflect on the sea, hiding the complexity that holds them up. More areas stop being workable and become something you route around. Lines are raised, connections tightened, steam leaks reduced just to keep the space barely operable. In places, boilers and ventilation are isolated to avoid additional risk as water advances. Vibration changes again, and the sound of water asserts itself more often. There is still operation, but the ship is losing ground by volume, not by lack of effort. Outside remains bright, but the bow already hints at a new balance. With water in corridors, movement becomes a technical obstacle. You lift your feet higher, fight for balance, and choose every step, especially as the list increases. Guidelines and higher points help cross sections where visibility collapses. Lighting has to stay above the waterline or it disappears too soon, and lanterns are repositioned constantly. On deck, activity grows and ropes are handled, still under a calm sea. The contrast hits hard. Above, organization. Below, space closing in. Operations shift into preservation mode. Steam is redirected to protect threatened lines and sustain what still feeds pumps and critical services. Lower circuits are isolated before moisture reaches failure points, preventing chain blackouts. Intakes and filters are cleared to keep efficiency in murky water full of debris. Tools are secured so they do not slide with the list and become hazards. Meanwhile, outside, the bow sits lower and lights still hold, as if the ship is hanging on by a thread. Light and instrument swings become more frequent and harder to tame. Damp gauges, pulsing lamps, irregular vibration. All of it says the system is near the edge. Panels are shielded and closed, and any vulnerable point gets sealed to delay electrical failure. The air loses clarity. Steam, reflections on the deck, and moving water distort distance. Operation still exists, but it is growing fragile. Outside, reflections on the sea become less uniform, hinting at a change the eye cannot fully explain. The sound of machinery starts yielding to the dominant sound of water. Pressures fall. Rhythms slow. Work shifts toward reducing danger and preserving routes upward. Instruments are still checked, but they do not respond like they used to. Light weakens, and flicker becomes part of the room, not a single event. The list is now felt in the body and in the way water moves. From outside, the bow is clearly lower, while inside the engine spaces face a gradual collapse. This is the stage of shutting down and isolating to prevent dangerous failures. Lines are closed, controls reduced. Components taken offline before water and pressure cause immediate damage. Movement happens mostly on higher levels now, because lower areas become turbulence and low steam. The lights surge, then fade as if the ship is losing its ability to hold on to normal. The space stops sounding industrial and starts sounding like water and metal. Without showing anything explicit, operations drift toward the end. Decades later, what remains is evidence on the Atlantic floor. Collapsed structures, corroded pipes, and broken instruments show how dense, tall, and control-heavy this space once was. Exploration light catches rivets, torn edges, flanges, and brass pieces half buried in sediment. The interior does not stay intact. It buckles, twists, and is slowly consumed by corrosion. Those details help reconstruct how the engine rooms were laid out and why moving through them in an emergency was so difficult. The ending lives in the contrast between function and silence. Steel ribs and piping runs mark where there was once constant motion, constant readings, constant adjustments. Now only particles drift through the beam and everything else is frozen in the dark. The engine rooms represent time purchased, power, pumping. Operation held for a few extra minutes as compartments were lost. Those minutes shaped what could be done elsewhere, with more light and more coordination. That is why this space, invisible to most in 1912, is still central to understanding Titanic.